You always look so nervous around me. The first time I really noticed her wasn't when she spoke to me, it was when she laughed. It wasn't loud or showy, but low and warm, like a sound meant for those who happened to be close enough to earn it. We'd seen each other before, at the café where I worked part-time, but that morning something shifted. She sat by the window, a book open beside her untouched coffee, sunlight resting across her hair in soft, gold tones. I caught myself looking longer than I should have. There was something about the way she carried herself, calm, self-assured, like someone who had lived enough to stop pretending. Every movement of hers felt intentional. The way she turned a page, brushed her sleeve, or smiled faintly when she read something she liked. I remember thinking, that's the kind of peace you can't fake. When I brought her order to the table, our eyes met. Just for a second, but long enough for me to forget what I was supposed to say. Her gaze was steady, curious, not cold. She seemed to notice everything, the small tremor in my voice, the way my hand hesitated when placing the cup down. You always look so nervous around me, she said softly, with a half-smile that somehow made my pulse louder. I laughed it off, or tried to. Maybe I'm just bad at coffee deliveries, I said, but the warmth in my face betrayed me. Her smile lingered. Maybe, she replied, tilting her head just slightly, the kind of gesture that felt more like an invitation than a tease. After that, I couldn't stop noticing her. How she came in every other morning, ordered the same thing, and sat by the same window. Sometimes she read, sometimes she just stared outside like she was listening to thoughts she couldn't say out loud. And sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, she watched me too. Those glances were quiet, brief, and dangerous. Because they made me wonder what she saw when she looked at me. Did she notice how my hands always fidgeted when she spoke? Or how I avoided her eyes when I felt too much? There was an unspoken tension growing between us, not heavy, but real. The kind that doesn't ask for permission, only recognition. One evening, after closing, I saw her through the glass door. She was leaving, her coat drawn close, the last of the daylight fading around her. She turned once, saw me wiping the counter, and smiled, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. As if to say, I see it too. And that was the moment I realized, this wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was the beginning of something neither of us had planned for. Something slow, quiet, and impossible to ignore. The days that followed began to feel like chapters from a story I wasn't supposed to be part of, yet couldn't stop reading. She came in as always, same table by the window, same coffee order. But something had changed. The air between us carried a quiet awareness, like we both knew the other was paying attention, even when pretending not to. I started to notice details I'd missed before. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. How her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup as if she were writing invisible words. Sometimes, when she laughed softly at something on her phone, it felt like sunlight breaking through a cloudy morning. She never said much. But her silence wasn't cold, it was comfortable. There's a kind of peace that comes from being near someone who doesn't need to fill every moment with words. I began to look forward to those quiet minutes when she was around. The world felt slower then. Lighter. One afternoon, when the cafe wasn't busy, she came to the counter instead of waiting for me to bring her drink. You always seem lost in thought, she said, leaning slightly forward, her tone curious but gentle. Maybe it's because I don't know what to say when you're here, I admitted before I could stop myself. Her eyes softened. Then don't say anything, she replied. Sometimes silence says enough. It shouldn't have felt like much, but it did. Those words stayed with me long after she'd gone. We began to talk more after that. Little things at first, books, travel, the weather, the noise of the city. But between the casual words, there were pauses filled with something more. Unspoken recognition. A quiet pull either of us named. One day, as she reached for her cup, our fingers brushed. Just lightly. But it was enough to still my breath. Her hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary, not by accident, but not entirely on purpose either. The air between us thickened, fragile, and real. She met my gaze, calm, knowing, and I looked away, pretending to focus on the counter. But my pulse betrayed me. Later that evening, I walked home replaying that moment in my mind, the warmth of her skin, the steadiness in her eyes. It wasn't attraction in the loud, obvious way. It was quieter than that. Deeper. Every time I thought about her, I found myself smiling, not because something had happened, but because something might. And that was the beauty of it, the not yet, the almost. The quiet pull between two people trying not to fall, yet inching closer all the same. It started to feel natural, the way her presence filled my days. She didn't need to say much, and I didn't need to ask why she kept coming back. There was an unspoken rhythm between us, like the kind that forms when two people simply start to understand each other without trying. She would arrive a little later than usual some mornings, and when I'd notice her through the window, I'd already be halfway through making her order. She caught on to that and smiled every time, that knowing, subtle curve of her lips that said she'd been expecting it. One quiet afternoon, she stayed long after most customers had gone. The sun was dipping low, throwing amber light across the room. I was wiping down the counter when she said, "You never sit. Always working. Don't you ever get tired?" I hesitated. Maybe. But it's easier to stay busy than to think too much. She looked at me for a moment, not judging, just seeing through me. Then she gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit then. Just for 5 minutes." I almost said no, but something about the softness in her tone made it impossible to refuse. So I did. For a while neither of us spoke. The café hummed with quiet, the kind of silence that felt like permission to just be. She sipped her coffee slowly, her eyes wandering to the street outside. I watched her in those small, unguarded moments, how the light caught the faint lines near her eyes, the way she breathed deeply, like someone learning to enjoy stillness again. "You're quieter than most people your age," she said suddenly. "It's nice. I guess I just don't want to say the wrong thing," I admitted, my voice low. She smiled gently. "You don't have to be careful with me." Something about that undid me a little. No one had ever said that to me before, not like that, not with that kind of calm assurance. Later, as she stood to leave, I walked her to the door. Outside, the sky had deepened into a pale orange glow. She paused, turning toward me. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For listening. For being easy to be around." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. But when she smiled and lightly touched my arm, barely there, just a soft brush of her fingers, I felt it long after she'd gone. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not just the touch, but the look in her eyes, the one that said she understood something I hadn't said out loud. Somewhere between her first smile and that small moment by the door, something had changed. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was connection, fragile, real, and growing stronger with every shared silence. Something subtle shifted after that evening. She still came by often, same soft greetings, same seat by the window, but now, there was a quiet awareness that hadn't been there before. Every glance felt loaded. Every pause between words seemed to hold something neither of us dared to name. I could feel it in the smallest moments, when our eyes met and neither of us looked away, or when she brushed past me and the scent of her perfume lingered like a whisper against my thoughts. It was the kind of tension that felt fragile, like one wrong move might break something beautiful. But alongside that pull came hesitation. Not because of her, but because of what people might think. She was older, graceful, self-assured, the kind of woman who carried her years with quiet dignity. And me? I was still figuring things out, my place, my future, myself. One afternoon, 2 of my coworkers teased me after she left. Nothing mean, just the kind of laughter people use when they sense something but don't understand it. Still, it stung more than I expected. When she came the next day, I tried to act normal, but she noticed right away. "You're quieter today," she said, studying me with that calm, steady gaze of hers. "Just tired," I lied. She didn't believe it. "No," she said softly. "Something's different." I sighed, leaning on the counter. People notice things. They talk. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, she looked down at her cup, tracing her finger along the rim the way she always did when she was thinking. And what do you think? Her voice wasn't defensive. It was gentle, curious, like she genuinely wanted to know. I hesitated. I think it's no one's business. But it still makes me think twice. She nodded slowly, her eyes distant. It always does. That was the first time I saw something shift in her expression, a flicker of vulnerability beneath her calm surface. It wasn't sadness exactly, but something close. Maybe she'd been through this before, the quiet judgment, the whispered assumptions. We didn't speak much after that. The silence between us that used to feel peaceful now felt uncertain. Heavy. Later that week, she didn't come in. The table by the window sat empty, sunlight falling across her usual seat like a memory I couldn't shake. I told myself it was nothing, that she'd just been busy, but the quiet stretched longer than I liked to admit. And when she finally returned days later, something in her eyes had changed. Softer. Cautious. Hi, I said, unsure of what else to say. Hi, she replied, with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We both felt it, that line between wanting and waiting. Between what was safe and what was honest. And suddenly, the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was a question neither of us was ready to answer. Days passed differently after that. Our easy rhythm had faded, replaced by a quiet restraint neither of us knew how to undo. She still came by, but less often now. And when she did, her smile was smaller, polite, almost careful. I pretended not to notice, but I did. Every time she walked in, my chest tightened with a mix of relief and guilt. It wasn't just about attraction anymore. It was about the silence that followed us everywhere, the one that carried all the things we never said. One afternoon, it started raining, one of those steady, endless drizzles that makes the world slow down. The cafe was almost empty. She sat in her usual seat, her coat draped neatly over the chair beside her. I brought her drink over, setting it down gently. Still pretending not to be tired? She asked, glancing up with that knowing half-smile. Still pretending you don't notice? I countered softly. That made her laugh, quietly, almost sadly. She looked out the window for a long time before speaking again. You remind me of someone I used to know, she said. Someone who looked at the world like it was full of promises waiting to be kept. And what happened to them? I asked. She took a sip of her coffee, her expression distant. They grew up. Learned that some promises aren't meant for us, no matter how much we want them. Something in her tone broke me a little. It wasn't regret, it was acceptance. The kind that comes from losing something you never got to hold in the first place. When she looked at me again, her eyes softened. You make it very hard to stay distant, she admitted quietly. But it's the only way this stays good. I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to tell her that she was the calm in my restless days, that her voice lingered in my mind long after she'd gone. But I also knew she was right. The line between comfort and confession was thin, and crossing it could change everything. For a moment neither of us moved. The rain outside deepened, the windows fogging just enough to blur the world beyond. She reached out then, just barely, her fingertips brushing against mine. It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't accidental either. Some things, she whispered, are meant to be felt quietly. And then she withdrew her hand, finishing her coffee in silence. When she stood to leave, I wanted to stop her. To say something, anything. But the words never came. I watched her go, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing longer than it should have. That night, the rain didn't stop. And neither did the ache that came with realizing how deeply I'd begun to need someone who might never truly be mine. I didn't see her for almost a week after that rainy afternoon. The cafe felt emptier, quieter, even the hum of conversation seemed to fade when she wasn't there. Every day, I found myself glancing at the door, waiting for that familiar silhouette to appear. She didn't. By the fifth day, I started telling myself to move on, to forget whatever this was before it turned into something painful. But the truth was, it already had. Then, one evening, just as I was about to close up, the door opened. She stood there, hair slightly damp, cheeks flushed from the cold. For a moment, we just looked at each other. No greetings, no small talk. Just quiet recognition. "I thought maybe you'd stop coming," I said finally. "I thought maybe I should," she replied. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, that same conflict I'd felt all week. She stepped closer, hesitating as if choosing her words carefully. "I didn't want to complicate your life," she said softly. "You're young, kind, and—" she exhaled, shaking her head. "You deserve someone who doesn't have to think twice." I smiled faintly, though my chest ached. "You always say that like you're protecting me." "Maybe I am." I took a small step forward, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. "What if I don't want protecting?" The room fell still. The air between us tightened, heavy with everything we'd been avoiding. She looked up at me, her eyes glimmering in the low light. "You don't know what you're asking for," she whispered. "Maybe not," I said quietly. "But I know what it feels like when you're here. And I know what it feels like when you're not. And I'd rather take the first one, even if it's complicated." For a long moment she didn't move. Then, slowly, she reached out, her hand trembling slightly as it found mine. The touch was gentle, hesitant, almost questioning. Her fingers slid against my palm, warm and real. She let out a shaky breath. "You make it sound so simple," she said. "Maybe it is," I whispered. "At least when we stop pretending it's not." She looked at me then, really looked. Whatever wall she'd built between us began to crumble, quietly, beautifully. Her thumb brushed over the back of my hand, and in that small, fragile touch, everything we'd tried to suppress came undone. No one spoke. The silence said enough. She stepped closer until we were only inches apart, her gaze flickering between my eyes and the floor, as if afraid to believe the moment was real. "This isn't easy," she murmured. "I don't need easy," I said. "I just need real." For the first time, she smiled without restraint, soft, sad, and entirely human. And in that moment, I knew something had changed. We had finally stopped hiding. And now, there was no going back. The next morning felt different. The world outside the café seemed softer somehow, like it had been reset overnight. She came in just after opening, no coat, no pretense, just that quiet confidence I'd come to recognize. I was behind the counter, pretending to wipe a spotless cup, when she met my eyes and smiled. It wasn't the careful smile she used before, it was warmer, more open. The kind that made everything inside me still for a moment. "Morning," I said, my voice lower than I meant it to be. "Morning," she echoed, stepping closer. For once, we didn't need to hide behind routine. No practice distance, no sidestepping what was there. I handed her coffee across the counter, our fingers brushing again, though this time neither of us pulled away. We sat together by the window, her usual spot. The early light spilled across her face, catching the faint curve of her lips as she stared out at the street. It was a quiet moment, but full of meaning. "I've been thinking," she said finally, her voice calm. "About what you said last night, about not wanting easy." I nodded, unsure where this was going. "I believe you," she continued. "But I also know that life complicates things. People talk, time changes everything, and we can't pretend that doesn't matter." I looked at her, searching for regret in her tone. There was none. Just honesty. "I know," I said softly. "But I also know that pretending this doesn't exist doesn't make it easier. It just makes it lonelier." She smiled faintly, turning to face me. "You really are too young to sound that wise." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just learned from someone who makes silence feel like a conversation." That made her laugh, a real, unguarded laugh. It filled the space between us, breaking whatever was left of the tension. When her laughter faded, she leaned in slightly, resting her hand on mine. Her touch was gentle, steady, no longer hesitant. I don't know where this will go, she admitted. But I know it's real. And I don't want to spend more time pretending it's not. I met her gaze, feeling that familiar warmth flood my chest. That's all I needed to hear. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. But for us, everything had. We sat there for a long time, two people quietly choosing honesty over fear. There was no grand confession, no dramatic ending. Just a shared calm, like finally exhaling after holding your breath too long. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated by the door, looking back with that same soft smile. You don't look nervous anymore, she said. I smiled back. That's because I finally stopped pretending. She nodded, then walked into the sunlight, leaving the air around me lighter, quieter, full of something that felt a lot like peace. And as I watched her fade into the day, I realized this wasn't an ending at all. It was the beginning of something beautifully uncertain, something real.